Sarah Furness and Sophie Adelman. I'll do a proper intro in a second, and we'll be talking about change in direction and what that means for this whole topic of resilience, which is part of our 5-week resilience challenge series, and we're now on week 4 coming to the end. So if you haven't caught it already, we have recorded the first 2 webinars on this. The first one was on goals, how to set them and how to stick with them. And the second one was on habits, how to make the good ones and how to break the bad ones and create generally healthy routines. So they're available on our YouTube channel at Juggle Jobs. And this week is all going to be about changing direction under pressure. So we will get started. First of all, I guess, why did we choose the topic of resilience? I mean, we are a flexible working platform. We're supposed to be about jobs. We're supposed to be about careers. So this in some ways is a little bit off topic, but no, it is actually very, very relevant for what we do, because if one is working flexibly, chances are that you have been that person that is working a different schedule to everyone else, or you have chosen to carve out a totally different type of career for yourself than the vast majority of people. You're no longer on a linear career path. And the reality of that is it's great and it's exciting, but you also do get quite a lot of knockback and people who don't quite understand what you do. And one does need a lot of resilience in order to be successful to do that. And similarly for the other side of what we do is obviously serving the businesses and making sure that they get the right people. This has been an incredibly tough time. You know, COVID-19 has meant that companies have had to really switch at scale, and they've had to change direction. All of the forecasts that we put in place at the beginning of the year largely blown out the water, unless you're Zoom or the e-commerce companies. So, and that again requires lots of resilience, having tough conversations with people, letting staff go, having difficult conversations with boards, etc. So we just felt that going a bit deeper in and analysing ourselves a bit more would be super helpful content for our audience. So just a reminder that next week we're going to move this back to Wednesday again, and we're going to go back to the evening session, which is 6 p.m. and that's going to be with Anouk Agasol, who's the CEO of Unleashed. They do everything in the people space for startups. So not HR. HR is sort of outdated. They think of, it's not human resource, it's all about people. And she'll be talking to us about resilience and what it means to build confidence, and particularly around imposter syndrome. And we'll also have Mika Vapin, who is a stress and transformation coach. So she talks about how we can harness stress. You know, we can't avoid it. So how do we capture it and make ourselves better? And so that's next week, Wednesday, the 8th of July, at 6 p.m. But on to today, and I'm so excited to introduce these 2 amazing women. Firstly, we have Sarah Furness, Sarah's got an amazing background, and she's going to talk to us a little bit in more detail throughout the session. But Sarah's actually an RAF pilot, so she spent the majority of her career in the military. So she knows a thing or two about working under quite serious pressure. I guess that kind of pressure that none of us have really experienced. Real adrenaline, real life and death situations. And recently she's transitioned into the world of being a performance coach. So also helping people in the military, but those out of it as well, to really develop those performance mindsets. So very excited to hear about Sarah talking on this topic today. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Sophie Adelman, who some of you, I think, know already. Sophie is the co-founder of WhiteHat. And she is just one of my favorite people. She's totally amazing. She's looking all embarrassed now. She's grown WhiteHat from a small company to, how many people are you now, Soph?
I lose track. Somewhere around 160 odd people now. Okay,
and in a really short space of time, they've raised venture capital money from West Coast of America, Lightspeed Ventures and also Index Ventures. And Sophie's been instrumental in getting that funding on board and also scaling the company. But WhiteHat also it's an educational platform and a recruitment platform. They help people to reinvent early. Essentially, it's transform the idea of universities, isn't it? So
we're building an alternative to university through apprenticeships. So right. and a path that appeals to people who don't want to go down the academic route.
Yeah, makes sense. So a lot of their business was all coaching, and it was internally, actually physically in a classroom. So when COVID-19 hit and lockdown happened, they really had to pivot at speed. And she's going to be telling us a bit more about that throughout the session. Just a couple of points. There is a Q&A function on Zoom, so please make sure that you are asking questions. And Kathy has shared the details around the event next week, so you guys can just click on that and book tickets for next week. Additionally, please do, if you have any thoughts as we're going along, do give us a bit of love on social media as well. All of our handles are at Juggle Jobs across the platforms. Right, so onto the main event. Sophie, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk to us about why you were interested in speaking on the broader topic of resilience in the first place?
Sure. I think the first reason that it was interesting to me is I think actually resilience is something that I've had to build myself. I don't think resilience is something that you're just necessarily born with. I think some people have a higher baseline in resilience. They more naturally bounce back. I probably am not one of those people. I generally take a little bit of a hit, but I've had to learn how to bounce back. And I think that resilience is a muscle that you can build over time. It's a skill that you can build. So rather than seeing it as something you either have or you don't have, it's something that we should all look to and focus on as we're growing in our careers and in our lives. So that's a personal reason. And then the second reason is that at WhiteHat, as I mentioned, we work with both young people and people who are further on in their career to help them reinvent themselves, to train and to grow in their careers, to become future leaders, as we call them. And we found that resilience is one of the core competencies, both that employers look for when hiring young apprentices, but also something that all of our apprentices want to build through their career, and it's a key component of our coaching practice. So I think it's something that we should all be focused on.
I just want to touch on something that you said there earlier on about some people are very good at just getting through and bouncing back, and you tend to take a bit of a hit. And this goes to the core of actually my misunderstanding of resilience when we were putting it together. I always thought that resilience was this perseverance thing, and that I was actually pretty good at resilience, and I realized that that isn't the case at all. And actually what you're describing in taking the hit is processing, working out, and how to come back. So I think
of it as like personal elasticity, right? It's kind of like you have to be elastic, you have to kind of stretch and come back into shape. And some people when that stretch happens go further so it takes them longer to bounce back, but it's the process of coming back to your center that's really important. I agree with you. I'm very persistent. I will put my head down and work through any problem, but and so I think people think that I'm naturally very resilient, but actually inside there's a level of turmoil that I try and sort of mask, and I think that is part of it. The masking is a key component. I don't know whether any of you have watched The King and I, the musical, but in The King and I, the lead, she sings a song that says, "Whenever I feel afraid, I hold my head erect and whistle a happy tune so no one will suspect I'm afraid." I think there's an element of like faking it until you make it, but at the same time, as you're going through these ups and downs, learning that you can keep going, that life doesn't end, and I think that's a learnt skill. And I personally feel that I didn't learn enough of that when I was a child. I didn't learn how to fail well, how to pick up, because I guess I didn't fail very much. And when the first time I failed, I had a quote unquote failure when I was at high school. And then I had what was a big failure for me, which was my first job. I was in banking and I hated it and I had a horrible time. And that took me a long time to bounce back from. And I think it's something that we need to build in ourselves now, but also make sure that if we have children, we're building that muscle early.
Love that. Sarah, is this something that you've seen in the military as well? That kind of confusion around, I just need to plug on and keep going until I break, and actually I won't break, macho. rather than thinking about resilience, as Sophie said, as more of an elasticity?
Yeah, 100%. There's so many things I want to pick up on what Sophie said. But the first thing is, I think it's easy to overlook the fact that it's 100% trainable. But also this idea that if you're tough, that you can deal with more crap, more rubbish. And also this idea that resilient people have an ability to suffer more. And it's almost like I've sort of come across this phrase, the struggle myth, recently, where your measure of resilience is how much you've had to struggle. And actually, if we build resilience and we have the tools, we can massively reduce our suffering. So our resilience is actually built by having the tools to respond in a way that doesn't increase our suffering. And what I've seen, and certainly what I've experienced myself, is that quite a lot of the time we bring it on ourselves by self-induced pressure, or looking for external approval, or all those sorts of things. So we could make ourselves more resilient by actually just making it easier in a way. And certainly in the military, we've got this kind of man up wet pants sort of philosophy, where you do see a lot of people being really tough. Then the next thing is they're like, actually need a break, and no one saw it coming. So I think there's a big misunderstanding about what resilience is and what you need to do in order to be resilient. You don't need to be a superhero, you just need to have the tools to have that elasticity and to be able to respond in a healthy way that serves us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's a great segue into talking about the tools themselves and today's topic, which is all about change in direction under pressure, whether that be a conscious choice in something that you have decided to do, or a change that is wrought on you, which is often much harder. Sophie, I just want to talk about the recent business experience that you've gone through with WhiteHat, because a large portion of the business pre-COVID actually did happen in a physical space, right? You're a tech startup, but with a physical element as well. Can you talk to us about the moment you realized that you needed to change the setup quickly? And then I've got some follow-up questions on that as well.
Yeah, so most of our coaching and teaching was happening in person, not necessarily in our building, but maybe at employers' buildings, and primarily operating within kind of the Greater London area. And actually, I think that the COVID situation accelerating quite quickly forced us to do something that we'd already been planning on doing, but just in a sort of shorter space of time. So in many ways, whilst it was a difficult change, I think we were mentally going in that direction, which I do think makes it easier. I think when you come up against a wall, which is a complete change in direction, that is harder. But the moment that I could think we realized it was probably very much in early March. I think we saw the train coming towards us. You saw what was going on in Asia. You saw the lockdowns coming in Spain and Italy. And although the UK government was making sort of positive noises, we're not going to need to go into lockdown, we felt increasingly that it was going to need to come into place. And I think a lot of tech startups responded early. And so about I think the 7th or 8th of March, we had a little bit of a sort of coming together conversation about, okay, we need to prepare for a lockdown situation. And the first thing I did was reach out to one of our teams, which is our data science coaching team, and sort of sent an email to them and said, hey, if we had to go virtual, would you guys be willing to be a pilot group? And what would we need to do in order to do that in the next week? Because that group, they were all quite new. They had smaller caseloads at that point, and they'd also all come from quite tech savvy organizations before they joined WhiteHat. A lot of our coaches are former teachers from schools, whereas a lot of these data science coaches had come from places like Ocado and Microsoft. And they seemed like the obvious group to work with. And we were also fortunate that we had a member of our team who'd worked at General Assembly and done a lot of virtual coaching. And so it was really tapping into their skills, their experience, and saying, you guys, here's a problem, go solve it. And what was really exciting was the way that they responded. Instead of going, oh no, what are we going to do? With, okay, if we were going to do it, these are the tools we'd need. This is the training we'd need. And I was like, well, great, let's price that up. Let's work out how much it's going to cost us. Let's call that person and see whether or not they'd be willing to do some training, and let's make it happen. And so in the space of a weekend, the data science team started the process of preparing. And once we'd done a short pilot with those guys for about a day and it had worked, we then set in motion training the whole coaching team, which is about 40 odd people at that point, in the space of about 4 days. We then decided, so that started on about the 7th. On the 13th, we decided to send everyone to work from home, and lockdown came in officially on the 23rd. By that point, the whole team had been working remotely for a week. We had a week where we knew it was working. And then I think from there, we've had to sort of adapt. But, you know, having foresight, I think, was really helpful in preparing mentally, but also putting in place the tools and training so that people felt confident going into virtual delivery.
I love it. That is a real success story. I just want to talk about you for a second in that role, because that all sounds very kind of like amazing, well planned, and awesome operation behind it. But how talk to me about you and what sort of tools you had to tap into for yourself in order to make it look smooth on the surface. That kind of analogy of the swan doing that under the surface, even though it's going smoothly on top.
I think the role of a leader in an organization, particularly once you get to some level of scale, is not to actually do the doing, but create clarity around decision making and direction, and then empower individuals to move forward. So, as I said, we had people in the team who I knew from interviewing and hiring all of them had the skills to make this happen. They had prior experiences, they had skills, and they were adaptable. One of our company values is, you know, we are all change makers. So, you know, tapped into that. Hey, you guys are change makers. We need to make this change. This is coming. So let's get ahead of it. What do we need to do? So that was empowering them to go and solve the problem. Then helping by making a decision quickly that, yes, this is feasible. Let's make it work. Let's go. So that was, you know, clarity of decision making, giving them the tools. So, you know, carving out the budget to be able to make it happen. And then sort of, again, pushing that positive message, clarity of communication to the whole organization that this is something we need to do. This is going to be successful. This is why it's going to be successful. And this is how we're going to keep adapting and changing to it. And I think you can't do it all. You have to rely on other people. But as a leader, it is about creating that clarity and decision making.
Brilliant. I love that. It's almost doing less, which is, I know you and I find hard. But what you do needs to be higher quality and empowering that team. Sarah, just moving on to you, because in part because of your military background, I was particularly interested in speaking to you about the topic of pivoting under pressure. Can you talk to us about why this is such an important skill to learn, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you're very focused and you're very focused on your goals, which is a really healthy thing to have, you can sort of become quite rigid. So it's almost finding a balance between that drive, but also that agility. And, you know, that's just sort of like a tightrope you walk. Interesting that in the military, we change all the time because we're being posted around all the time. We have short notice deployments. I think one of the most commonly reported problems in the military is adjustment disorder, just because our futures are often very uncertain. So it's something that we sort of deal with on a day-to-day basis. But again, I'm not sure we necessarily have the tools all the time, and we tend to just think we can just man up and get through it. And of course, once you have family, the cliche is true, everything changes. And so it's not just you that you're pulling from pillar to post, it's your family as well. So you kind of feel like you're letting them down as well. So it can put a lot of pressure on you, because, like you said earlier, that change is enforced, and you know, people like to be autonomous, and in the military we have to follow orders a lot of the time, so you don't always have that autonomy, so that can be a real kind of challenge to deal with.
And what do you personally tap into in order to handle that level of change? Because I agree with you. I think change where you're at one step ahead of it, or you're in control of the decision entirely, is completely different to orders. You know, all of the great stuff that comes with the military, but that is particularly tough. What did you tap into in order to manage those transitions successfully?
Well, there's, I think, a couple of really important things. First of all, I think it's really important to keep sight of your values, what's important to me. And I wanted to, be able to tell everyone that I was a cool helicopter pilot, but there came a point when I realized that, my son came first, and helicopters are cool, but my son's cooler. So I chose a job that was a non-flying role because that was what became most important. So I think having that kind of honest conversation with yourself is really important. But also in any environment, no matter how dictatorial you think it is, we always have a choice, and we always have our circle of influence and our circle of concern. And no matter how helpless you think you are, there is something you can do, even if it's to say, this is not the job for me anymore. And that's very drastic. And I wouldn't necessarily, there's a spectrum of what you can do. So I think it's having that kind of confidence in your values, but also having that confidence in yourself. I am worthy of changing in accordance with my values, and I am capable as well, and what can I do about this?
Completely agree. I've read through a lot of your material, which is amazing, by the way, and everyone on the call should check it out. It's Sarah, remind us of the exact URL. Is Wellbeit
Coach.
Wellbeit Coach.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And you talk a lot about mental fitness, and we hear about physical fitness, obviously, but not mental fitness as a term quite so much. Can you describe to us what you mean by that, and how does one cultivate it?
Yeah, absolutely. So mental fitness, one of the reasons that you might want to use mental fitness is certainly in the military, some people are a bit hesitant about things like mindfulness, wellness, well-being. So part of it is just the language that we use can sort of turn some people off. And it's understanding no one has an issue with physical fitness. So why do we have an issue with mental fitness? In exactly the same way, and in the same way that we can train our physical fitness, which means we're less likely to sustain an injury, it's the same is true for mental fitness. So you can train it proactively, and the more mentally fit you are, the less likely you are to sustain an emotional injury. And I'm not saying bad things won't happen, I'm not saying people won't get sick, but you can do something about it. And again, I feel like sometimes we think, well, that's just going to happen. Well, it doesn't have to, because we can build that muscle. And also, I'm a really big fan of mindfulness, and through my coaching, I've learned just how awesome our brain is, and how little we understand, and how much we can use it as a force for good, but often we use it as a force for bad because we torture ourselves, we beat ourselves up. So once you learn how to use your brain as a force for good, you can become really mentally fit and sort of feel like you can take on the world a little bit, which is, why wouldn't you want to feel like that?
I totally, by the way, I'm just going to jump in because I totally agree with this point about mental fitness. I heard somebody told me this phrase, which I repeat again and again, which is your beliefs are just thoughts you repeated again and again. So and that you are not your thoughts. In other words, you can create distance between thoughts that just kind of happen and who you actually are. It's not your identity. I think that comes from Eckhart Tolle's New Earth, where he talks about, you are not your thoughts. That is not your identity. And we all know that, right? Those random thoughts that come into our brain when we stand near the edge of a cliff that we might jump. Well, actually, that's just a sort of slightly random thought that pops into our head. But if you think about thoughts like, I am not a good person, or I am useless, and you repeat that again and again in your head, and that starts to become a belief. But that's not really you. That's just a thought that's repeated over and over. And I think once you create that distance between you and your thoughts, you can actually start to see things that happen to you, or things that are happening around you, with a little bit of distance, and start to almost be maybe amused by how other people act or how situations play out. So I think that mental fitness piece is really important. The other thing that I personally have found really helpful over the last few months particularly is to take on the mindset of life is just a learning journey. It's almost like somebody described it as life school. So everything in life is just an opportunity for you to grow and learn. And you don't necessarily need to believe this, but the idea that you are exactly where you need to be. So every challenge that comes up, every situation that you have to overcome, every positive thing that happens to you is meant to be happening to you now in order to be able to help you grow. So, and sometimes you choose not to grow. Sometimes you choose not to use that learning and actually push forward. But if you embrace it and you use it as a learning opportunity, it almost reframes it in a positive light, and you start to think, how is this in my favor? How can I make this a learning experience, a positive experience for the rest of my life? Just, it helped me reframe it a little bit.
I completely agree, because it also gives one autonomy over those negative events as well. I guess just going a bit deeper on that, and it's slightly off topic, but I think it's super important, is how do you healthily respond to those negative events particularly when they happen to you, rather than it's a bad choice? And how, because I think reframing it as a learning opportunity is one thing, but there is sort of damage and scar tissue as well. So how does one build resilience without necessarily causing damage, or can you?
Do you want to take that one, Sarah?
Yeah, again, loads of really
difficult question.
I think that unfortunately a lot of I'm not one for lying on a sofa blaming it all on my parents, my terrible childhood, but a lot of the damage we get from childhood because, you know, we've been taught that we need to be perfect, or that we need to be likable, and it's kind of just one of those things that happens. How do we not become damaged? Well, I think it's by understanding that we already carry certain wounds and we already carry certain limiting beliefs. And like Sophie said, if you tell yourself enough times, I'm not worthy, actually the brain will start to make that real. And it's weird, you'll actually start to subconsciously influence your choices. So if you think I'm unlovable, you will subconsciously push people away and you will make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it's really important to understand the root beliefs that are holding you back. And it's not necessarily somewhere that people want to go, but any kind of failure or setback is an opportunity for the insight and go, what is it that is really hurting me about this? It's because I'm afraid that I'm not enough. And then you can start to let go of those limiting beliefs, and grow that growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset, again, is something you're not born with it. You're sort of taught it while you're at school, because we're taught we have to be great at everything. And, you know, like Sophie says, you maybe haven't failed at anything until you get a bit older. And then suddenly you're terrified of failing. And you're terrified that if I don't show up perfectly in every moment, that I'm not enough. And it's just giving yourself permission to carry these, to have this frailty and go, yeah, you know, everyone is. So
that's all part of who I am. I
just
want to touch on
the childhood. Sorry, on the childhood point, I'd never come across this idea before, that you have these like childhood traumas, because like I had a perfectly happy childhood. I didn't have any problems with that. And then somebody recommended a book called, I was just looking it up, called How to Overcome Your Childhood by the School of Life. I think it's an Alain de Botton book. I didn't put that on my reading list. I can see Chi-Chi's on the call and from my team, and I just sent out a reading list to my team, and this wasn't on it, but it is a book that I read this year. And it talks about actually these traumas can be really small things, you know, that play out through your life, and you need to recognize them and deal with them. So that's a good book if you want to learn more about it. It's a great book. It helps to frame it a bit better.
And also, I don't think, I'm not saying that you have to sort of relive, you know, like you say, they're often quite small traumas. I'm not suggesting that we're all really badly damaged. It's just, and we don't have to go back into Pandora's box. It's just recognizing that, you know, these are the sorts of things that have shaped our fears. And so now, once you become aware of them, because I think something like the prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed until you're 25. So any kind of, you know, you don't get picked for the netball team, you know, your teacher tells you that you were terrible at something, or, you know, maybe they didn't, but maybe you took that way. Your rational brain is not fully developed, so you're not equipped to deal with it yet. So that's why it's almost inevitable, but it's also why I wouldn't necessarily say we have to go back there and go, oh, it's all so terrible. We just go, okay, that's where I am today now. How can I let go of these limiting beliefs?
Sometimes it's even just identifying it, right? Just knowing, oh, that's why that happened. That's why I think like that. Oh, that releases you from this like crazy thing that's going on. Bring this back to kind of the resilience point. I think one of the things that helped me build resilience was actually starting to accept reality as it is. I think a lot of the pain that people go through in life, myself included, is fighting reality, trying to change people, wishing that the world was different, wishing that I was different, wishing that, a situation was different, and fighting the way it is rather than flowing with it. And I think that's one of the lessons of resilience, or building resilience, which is not fighting it, not trying to control. This is the idea of going from control to create. You create when you're going in the direction of travel rather than trying to resist it. When you resist it, you're very static and you're more likely to break. Those skyscrapers in Japan that they build on these like rubber pads in order so that they don't fall over when an earthquake hits. Well, if you build it straight onto the earth, it will break, it will crack, but it doesn't crack because it has that ability to move. And I think we need to all think of ourselves as a bit like the skyscrapers built on rubber pads, that we have to have that flex, that suppleness in order to be able to move. And otherwise, that's why you break.
I didn't know that. I love that fact. That's a good one. I want to
geography. I did actually learn something.
I want to touch on two more topics before we move on to audience questions. We're getting some great ones through. Just make sure that you put them on the Q&A on Zoom, everyone, and I will leave plenty of time for questions to Sarah and Sophie at the end. So one of the things that we talked about before this session was this concept of gender and resilience. Sarah, I'm interested to get your view on this because you've been in a very male-dominated environment. Do you think that the resilience journey is different for men and women? And if so, can you explain why?
Very good question. Difficult one to answer because I'm not a man. So, and I'm very conscious that your thoughts are your thoughts, and we can't read other people's minds. So I don't want to upset anyone here. But from what I've observed, women do seem to be a little bit more willing to accept when things aren't going very well. I think we beat ourselves up quite a lot, but I think everyone does that. And I do think that perhaps we're more willing to talk about things. Now, I will caveat that with, I've learned this the hard way. You can over talk about something and it becomes, you sort of turn it into something massive. So, problem shared is problem half, but problem shared with 12 people is a problem magnified by 12. I'm sort of realizing. So I'm not saying that women have got it right, but I would, in general, I'd say women are more likely to just talk about stuff, and that can be hugely liberating, just sort of acknowledging it, because the first step is acceptance. Like Sophie said, accepting a reality rather than fighting it, because if you're fighting it, you're actually taking away a lot of capacity, and you're chipping away at your resilience, ironically, by kind of trying to sort of deny or resist it. So I think that's probably a kind of a really useful tool in our armory. But I also think there's something to be said for, if you don't dwell on something, Andy from Headspace, I love Headspace, says, if you don't think something's a problem, is it still a problem? So I think we can probably learn from both approaches, and I hesitate to say one is specifically male, one specifically female, but that's a sort of trend that I tend to see.
Understood. So it's tapping into slightly different tools. Sophie, I'm coming to you on this topic as well next.
On how men and women deal with these issues differently. I'm not sure I agree that women and men necessarily deal with it differently. I think it's down to individual personalities. I'll take my mum as an example. My mum likes to be in control and is not very flexible. whereas my husband is very flexible. So the two people in my life are, I think it's this mindset that you grow up with, this learning to fail, the experience of it. I think there is a particular point for women when if they become mothers, where suddenly you learn to have to let go of control. So I was definitely probably more in the control mindset before I had kids. And then once you have children, you lose all control of everything in your life to such a degree. And that may be a transition point where you actually start to be much more flexible, much more elastic. Your life goes through such a transition that it fundamentally changes who you are. Now, I think men have that as well. But I think women have much more of a journey into that. At least that's my experience of it. But I think personally, I think it comes down to these early childhood experiences of failure and learning to get up again and not having to be perfect.
Good. All right. Makes sense. And something that both of you have touched on a few times, so I want to talk about it now, is this idea of growth mindset and fixed mindset, which we've heard about. And Sophie, I know that you and I both interview people on this. Can you talk to us about why it's important to cultivate a growth mindset, and similarly for you as a business owner, why it's important to hire people with that? What direct impact does that have on the company?
I think a lack of flexibility is always very challenging in a fast growing business, because things change every single day. And if somebody is always so focused on one particular outcome or one particular way of doing things, they're not always questioning the status quo, then it becomes a blocker to the company's growth and your growth, because you're having to adapt to the external situation, you're having to adapt to the internal situation. You know, we've grown 3x from like 40 people a year ago to 160 people, and that has meant that people's jobs have changed, the way that we communicate has changed, the way that we're now working from remotely. And I think we have got some people in the team who don't necessarily have a growth mindset. You know, identifying that is hard, but when you have those people, you quite quickly start to realize, as the business starts changing, that they stay and everyone else moves up and to the right, and then you need to move those people out. But identifying them is difficult, and what I tend to look for is past examples of where they've adapted, where they've bounced back. I'm a big advocate of the WHO method, which is it's a useful book to read. It's quite short, and it has a methodology for how to hire consistently great people. And in it, they have something that I love, which is called the top grading interview, which is a very, very detailed and intensive interview. I'm not sure whether you use it, Ron, but it's you go through and you ask the same questions about people's each step of a person's career, which means it can take quite a long time when you're dealing with a senior person. But one of the stages is what was one of the low points in your previous role. And then you don't just let them go, oh, it's this point. You say, okay, talk to me about it. What happened? How did you respond? And it's really digging into that experience, because what you want to understand is not just what did they do, but how did they think and what did they learn? So that's the way I identify it. But I'm not always right.
No, I love that. That's I'm gonna try. I think I sort of do that, but that sounds more detailed. So we'll get the resource from you after this and share it with everyone. Sarah, in your coaching business now, and again, you've talked about this fixed mindset, growth mindset. How do you get people to, because as you say, the first step is acceptance, right? Recognition that there's a fixed mindset there. And then we can talk about the change to get to the growth mindset as well.
Yeah, so I think I have done sort of lessons on this, and I wrote a blog on it as well, actually. And I totally consider myself to be growth mindset. And I was quite astonished to discover that I have fixed mindset traits. So I think the first thing is that we all have traits or maybe blind spots. So we might think, well, I can't play a musical instrument. Well, that's a fixed mindset, actually. So a fixed mindset is not fixed. And we'll have areas in our lives where we are more fixed and where we're more growth. And also we'll have periods of our life where we feel more fixed and more growth. But ultimately, recognizing is, are you afraid of failure? Are you constantly trying to prove your worth? And do you seek that from outside? And I know a lot of people, we kind of want to hear we're doing okay. because we believe that we're not capable of being any better than we are today. So it becomes so important that we're enough as it is, and we need to hear that from the outside world. And of course, you know, the outside world's getting on with its life, so you don't always get that validation, and you kind of like, and then you might decide not to try at all, because it's better that than suffer the humiliation of failure. So I really liked it when I sort of reread the book by Carol Dweck, Growth Mindset, because she's like, you know, what you are today is just a starting point. And I was like, how brilliant. You know, because there are bits about myself I really don't like. How that's fantastic. I don't have to stay that way. You know, so it's kind of liberating to think that, you know, whoever you want to be, you can be. And it's not to confuse willpower alone with getting to your goals. You also need to identify strategy, and you need to be willing to take feedback and maybe change that strategy. But the growth mindset basically says, you know, where you are today is your starting point, and, you know, kind of aim for the stars, and expect to have some setbacks on the way, really.
I love that. So think of today as the starting point.
And there's also this idea, which is also helpful, between having an internal scorecard and an external scorecard. So I definitely have generally had an external scorecard. I like the external validation. If you look at some of the most successful people, they actually have an internal scorecard. They know that they have, it's almost like they're checking off against their own values and what's important to them. Warren Buffett, in his book, it's up here, it's one of these massive tomes at the top, and it's called The Snowball. I haven't read it all, actually. It's too long. It talks about every single like cough he's ever had. I mean, it's too much. But if you read the crib notes, he very much has an internal scorecard, and that's why he's able to be single-minded about how he lives his life and the decisions he makes. And so as you're thinking about that, figuring out, you know, oh, am I always working to an external scorecard? How can I identify, to Sarah's point, the values that are really important to me and the things that I consider to be success? And once you're grounded in what success looks like for you, it's much easier to make difficult decisions. You can make bold decisions, you can make brave decisions, you can make decisions that you know, others wouldn't, because you're working to your own internal scorecard and your own internal life plan.
Yeah, I read something similar on this, and actually started trying to develop a habit recently over the last few months, and I've found it super helpful, which is to make a mental note at the end of the day of all the wins, because I found that I naturally just focus on all of the losses, and, you know, I know them inside out, back to front. But if I was just feeding my mind the losses all the time without acknowledging the wins, that was just grinding me down. So balancing it out was just really important for the positivity and moving forward. I'm going to open up to questions now, but before I do, I just want to sort of ask one question to Sarah, which is, and I think a lot of people, as I'm getting the questions through, might be feeling this as well. So I'm quite good at change in direction and running towards the change. I almost cultivate that adrenaline feeling, but often afterwards I can feel drained and struggle to see the positives in the situation. Is this something that you see amongst people you coach, and how would you help them to, I guess, reframe that situation? So
yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think it's really, really normal, and I see it in the people I coach and just the people that I work with and myself, because again, I mean, it sort of comes back to growth mindset a lot, and understanding that change quite often takes time. I mean, I teach air safety as well, and we talk about engaged air safety culture and how we all have to believe in it. We all have to believe in a learning, flexible, just culture, and it's incremental. So you're not going to see immediate results, and you sort of, and as long as you are aligned with your value and your purpose, that hopefully is enough, and you just got to believe a bit. But it is hard because we are results driven, so it is really natural. And I think also we have to understand how change happens. So the graph, you know, for behavior change, let's say, is not linear. It's sort of a jaggedy one, and you will have setbacks, and you will have days when you're like, I am nailing this, and then days when you feel like you've kind of gone back 2 steps. And that's really, really normal. So kind of having being able to detach from an expectation of immediate success or obvious success, I think is really, really helpful.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, I'm going to open up to questions now. So we've got Jamie. Whilst I agree it is important to take the positives and life learning from any situation, when you've lost your job through, as you believe, no fault of your own, there is always an element of self-doubt. Why did they pick me? Why not XYZ? Why me? Who did it upset? Particularly now when so many are in the same position and when your next career move is at best speculative, how do you retain positivity? How do you stop the guard going back up? Sophie, over to you.
Oh, that's a tough one. So when I was leaving my previous company, Hired, I didn't get on with my new boss, new CRO, and I didn't have a great experience of that, of working with him, and ended up leaving quite quickly, but felt a little bit like I didn't really have a choice. And so I understand that feeling of, you know, that why me? Why is this happening to me? And I think, first of all, there's no power in victim mentality. I think that's the first thing to say. That's not to be unkind. It's something I say to myself. In fact, I have a Post-it on my desk that says there's no power in being a victim. You have to drive the car. You have to create your own reality. I think, again, this question of how is this in my favor is a good one. So often these things, whether you believe in karma or fate, the door tends to open even when you think it's shutting. And so, you know, leaving a situation, even when it's not on your own terms or not in the way that you wanted, can actually be a positive in the long run, even if it doesn't feel like it immediately. Now, I know that doesn't help if you're trying to pay the bills, or you know, it doesn't help with the short-term pain. But again, you're going back to this mindset of how is this in my favor? How do I take this and see this as happening to me because I need it to happen to me, because this is the next stage of my journey, because everything in life is a growth lesson, a growth opportunity. I find a way to move out of that victim mentality. And once you move out of that victim mentality, there's this idea of moving from scarcity to abundance. Suddenly the universe kind of conspires to make it happen. And that's not being like all like, you know, so tree huggy about it. I genuinely think once you move from a negative sort of energy and negative mentality into a positive mentality, good things do come to you. We've all experienced that, right? Where we've been, you know, negative and everyone kind of feels it, and they don't want to support you, they don't want to help you. When you're in a positive mindset, actually, you know, things kind of tend to flow to you. And I don't necessarily think it's because actually things are coming to you. I think it's because you actually see the things that are around you. You see the opportunity. So I'm not sure whether that completely answers your question, Jamie, but I think it is about just catching the negative thought and flipping it around and figuring out how do you turn a bad situation into an opportunity for you. And it's hard, but it is possible.
But because also that positive energy, then other things feed on that as well. Jamie, we actually we've written a piece on that, so I'll make sure that gets shared after the session as well. I'm going to move on to the next question and direct this to Sarah. What daily rituals, habits do you have to work on your positive mindset? Have you adapted any that make a quick difference?
Okay, yeah, good question. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of mindfulness, and I've been practicing it for a long time, but I do find that the number one thing that holds people back is these limiting beliefs. And I totally resonate with what Jamie was saying about, you know, why me? And I've asked myself that question all the time, but it's acknowledging, so becoming aware and then just letting them go, and acknowledging when you're doing self-harm. So quite often a question I ask myself is, am I harming myself right now by indulging this thought or this feeling? And mindfulness has just given me this tool to be able to first of all acknowledge and realize that it's normal. So don't be too hard on yourself, because this is normal, but then also acknowledge this is not serving me, step back from it, let it go. And the more you practice it, the more space you get from those unpleasant emotions, those injurious, self-fulfilling thoughts, the more you start to see them for what they are, which are those are the things that are holding you back. These are not the things that define me. The world is not out to get me. I was just unlucky in this case. So yeah, basically number one is mindfulness for me. I can't sort of rate it highly enough.
And specifically within that, I love that. It's about cultivating that discipline to check that inner voice and check, is this a feeling or a voice that is actually causing me harm or good? And if it's harm, then it's not going to go anywhere. And keep checking that. That's a great practical tool. I'm going to take that on. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We've got James. What strategies have you used to convert the can't do into can do? This can be a challenge to overcome at different levels of an organisation as well as personally. Sarah, thoughts on that?
I mean, there's a really cool little, you can get like dinner mats for children that talk about growth mindset. Again, here we are again. It says, rather than saying, I haven't achieved this, you just put yet on the end. I haven't achieved this yet. You know, the power of language. I love language, and I love how once we know what words to use and once we speak to ourselves in a more positive language and kind of flipping it on its head, you know, it's amazing how instantly it changes something for you. So yeah, that'd probably be my number one thing.
Brilliant. I love that one. And last question is from Chichi. Sophie, the validation piece is an interesting one because it's something women struggle with a lot. I love this idea about an internal scorecard. I do too. I think it's great. What other steps can you take in order to protect yourself from seeking external validation and feeling the need to prove yourself all the time? Sophie, if you can answer this one, that would be great. I'd love to know this.
I don't have necessarily the answer because I definitely have more of an external scorecard, but I'm learning to try and cultivate this internal scorecard. I think it's being able to tap into what feels right for you in your life. You know that you know when something's not right. Your emotions tell you that something isn't aligned with who you are. And I think it's getting in, there's this idea of alignment, like you being aligned with yourself. When you're not aligned with yourself, in other words, you're doing things for other people, you're doing things to prove something, you feel it. Like when you actually sit with the feeling, you feel out of alignment, right? You feel anxious, you feel stressed, you feel under pressure. When you're actually in alignment, when you're actually working to your internal scorecard, it all flows. And so I think the first thing is starting to be mindful of your emotions as a compass. By the way, this is not my idea, this is my coach's idea. I'm totally ripping her off, but you know, this is the idea of your emotions are your compass that guide you to whether or not you're in alignment or not in alignment. And if you feel the negative emotion coming up, you feel that stress, it's okay, what do I need to do to get myself back in? So that's the first thing. I'm a big believer in visualization. So I send an email out every year just before Christmas to my team, encouraging them to use the time over the Christmas period to take stock and to set their intentions, not their January resolutions, their New Year's resolutions, but their intentions for the next year. And their intentions are broader, not so specific. And to start by actually visualizing what their kind of like perfect day, their perfect life would feel like in a year's time. And I think a lot of people work on the day-to-day. I actually spoke to somebody yesterday who's thinking about quitting her job at a company that's not doing well. And she's like, well, I said, well, what are you thinking about? Like, where do you want to be in a year's time? And she said, well, there's this company that I really like. I was like, whoa. Okay, let's stop there. That's a solution. We can find lots of companies, but you need to start by figuring out what matters to you. Where do you want to be? What are your internal motivations? How do you want your life to look like? We can work backwards from there because there's a million different ways to get there. But, you know, starting with a next day solution is not the answer. And I think it's about basically looking up, putting your gaze on the horizon, and then navigating from there. And I think once you've got your gaze on the horizon, that is an element of, that's kind of like a visual version of an internal scorecard.
Brilliant. I love that. We are unfortunately out of time, but that was honestly superb. I've learned so much, and I hope everyone else has. We will be emailing out all of the information, all of the books that have been referenced today, all of the blogs. Everything will be sent to you. It's actually on the screen already. I think Kathy's been super. Oh yeah, she has also posted all of the links in the chat section as well. So if you want to grab that, but we will be sending it out to you all as well. Very big thank you to you both. That was really wonderful. And just a reminder that next week's session is all around building confidence, and particularly talking about imposter syndrome as well, which I think really dovetails nicely to some of the topics that have come up today around positive mindset and that internal scorecard. So it'll be the last in the Resilience Challenge series. We'd love to hear from you as well. If you've got things around resilience that you'd like to share, our social handles are @JuggleJobs. We're going to post this up on YouTube as well. And as always, we'd love to hear feedback from you. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a happy Thursday. Take care.
Thanks, Ron. Bye. Bye, Sarah.